Watka Nuarado Sewagoego. Greetings, everyone. Lindsay Jungens Denobrant de Waxanazre, Gandeke Nini Wageno, Waganyato. Hello, my name is Lindsay Brandt, and I'm from Gandeke, which is the place name for Tyendinaga Mohawk Territory, and I'm a member of the Turtle Clan here in Tyendinaga. I wanted to take a few moments to speak to you about land acknowledgements and what the importance is behind that and the meaning behind that. For myself, when I acknowledge land, I'm not only acknowledging the land and the peoples that are the caretakers of those lands, but also my connection to the earth itself, to my Mother Earth, and also to my connection to all of creation. And so I think I would encourage each of you to establish what your relationship is to the land and what your connection to the place that you're living in is. So what does it mean to you to be outside and experience nature in the way that I'm experiencing it right now? What do you feel and think and listen to or um, move through when you're outside? So it's important to think about those things and to think about the caretakers of these lands as well. Right now I'm on Mohawk territory, but just outside of this community and heading towards what is now known as Kingston, um, it was shared territory between many groups. So the Anishinaabe, the Haudenosaunee, and the Huron-Wendat people shared these lands. And so we give our greetings and thanks to them for taking on that role and that responsibility, and we recognize that they're the true caretakers of these lands. But we also think about what it means to share these lands and what it means to share all of us to share in connection and in relationship with each other. So I really encourage you to think about that and what that means for you, and to explore and get out on the land as much as possible and really enjoy, cherish, and love these lands and take care of them, and they'll take care of you as well. Yawagoa, thank you very much.
Good afternoon. My name is Linda Colgan, and I am one of the coordinators of Science Rendezvous Kingston. Thank you very much for your interest in our webinar today, The Story of a Fossil. I'm going to turn things over to Dr. Linda Suji in a moment, who is going to introduce our speaker. But just for your information, this webinar is being recorded today so that people who aren't able to attend in person today can watch this on demand, sort of like Netflix, a few days from now when we post it onto our virtual conference site. What I would like to let you know is that Kala will be presenting her presentation, and she will answer questions at the end. So if you have questions that you would like to ask, and I'm sure you will have lots of interesting questions to ask, What we're going to do is ask you to enter them into the Q&A box that appears on the bottom of your screen. What will happen is that Linda Suji will gather up all these questions, and at the end, Kala will answer them for you. Again, we are grateful to Kala and Linda for being here today, and we are incredibly appreciative of the fact that so many people are interested in our Science Rendezvous Kingston webinars. We do it for you. We hope you enjoy this. We'll see you at the end of the webinar. Enjoy.
Hello. I'm so happy to introduce Kala Carbone, who will give a presentation on the story of a fossil. So I'll give you a little bit of background on Kala. So she completed her undergraduate degree in Queens in 2011 with a major in geology and a minor in classical studies. She actually started as a classics major, but she took some paleontology courses and was inspired to switch over to geology after she had them. She did her honors thesis here at Queens on some 565 million-year-old fossils from Newfoundland from a geological period called the Ediacaran. She went on to do a master's with Professor Guy Narbonne here at Queens, studying the evolution of the first moving organisms by looking at early trace fossils in the Northwest Territories. And she did some very cool field work to discover those fossils. She has to date published 3 scientific peer-reviewed papers as well. And she even coined the name of an Ediacaran fossil, which was likely the tube of a polychaete worm, called Sequitubulus annulatus. Perhaps it's pronounced like that. After she completed her master's, she did fieldwork with the Royal Ontario Museum, collecting fossils from a new Burgess Shale type locality in British Columbia in the Rocky Mountains called Marble Canyon. It's a site with fossils that are around 505 million years old. She then worked as a preparation technician at the Royal Tyrrell Museum in Alberta, where she found, collected, and prepared Cretaceous fossils from the Canadian Badlands. She was also involved in the creation of various fossil displays, including the dinosaur skeletons that are now viewable at the Royal Alberta Museum, the RAM, in Edmonton. Since then, she's worked as a field assistant and research assistant on various geological projects based out of the University of Nebraska-Lincoln in the US, and also here at Queen's University, including ongoing exhibit and outreach work with the Miller Museum. So Kala's worked with all sorts of fossils from so many different time periods throughout Earth's history, and she has experience with the whole process from finding and studying fossils to creating displays in museums. And our presentation will talk about all the work that takes place behind the scenes before you get to see that fossil on display at a museum like the Museum of Nature or the Miller Museum.
Thank you, Linda, very much for your introduction. And just give me a second while I share my screen. All right. Hi, everyone, and thank you so much for tuning in. Today, I'm going to be talking to you about paleontology and how a fossil gets from the ground into a museum for people like you to see. The first thing we need to talk about is what is a fossil. A fossil is the preserved remains of a living organism or creature. There are lots of different types of fossils and lots of different ways that they can be preserved. For example, on the left here, we have an insect preserved in amber. Amber is actually fossilized tree sap. So this insect would have gotten caught in the tree sap and died, and then later that tree sap would have been fossilized. Beside that, we have an example of a carbon film of a leaf. In this situation, a leaf would have been squished really hard between different layers of sediment, and all that would be left of the leaf is this carbon film. Beside that, we have a lizard skeleton. And so here, the entire skeleton of this lizard has been replaced by minerals. So the skeleton is now all rock. And then finally, we have this dinosaur footprint here. And footprints, including trackways and trails, are called trace fossils. And that's because they don't preserve the actual creature that made them, but instead they preserve traces or the behaviors of the creatures that made them. So fossils can tell us a lot about what the world looked like before our time. And a paleontologist is a person who studies those fossils to learn about the ancient world. But there are lots of different steps involved in studying a fossil. First, you have to be able to find a fossil. Looking for fossils is called prospecting. Once you've found a fossil, you have to find the best way to get the fossil out of the rock. This is called collection. And then after this, once the fossil makes it back to the lab, you have to clean it up so that you can see it properly, because usually it's covered in a whole bunch of other rock. Once the fossil is nice and clean, paleontologists can do research or study the fossil to learn more about what the creature, what the life of the creature was like. And then finally, paleontologists would like to share what they've learned with the world. And so we have to create displays, often in museums. So those are the 5 main steps of what a paleontologist would do. But let's go through those steps as if we were a paleontologist studying dinosaurs in Dinosaur Provincial Park. So as you can see from this photo here, this is Dinosaur Provincial Park. It's in the Canadian Badlands in Alberta. It's one of Canada's most famous paleontological sites. It's a very interesting looking landscape. You can see there's a whole bunch of hills and canyons, but 75 million years ago, this area looked very different. Instead of these hills and canyons, it was actually a series of streams and rivers with lots of lush vegetation and plant life. It was actually right up against a big sea that covered Saskatchewan and Manitoba and actually connected the north and south. So the west coast and east coast of North America were separated. Now imagine you are a paleontologist who wants to study these dinosaur fossils. First thing a paleontologist must do is to find the fossils that they want to study. Paleontologists spend a large portion of their summer outside looking for fossils, like you can see on the picture on the right. There are a whole bunch of different tools that a paleontologist will keep in their backpack when they're looking for fossils. Some of the most important being a notebook, a camera, and a GPS. This is because notes, photographs, and location information are just as important as the fossils themselves. So this information all gets collected and kept with the fossil if it gets collected too. An example of why this information might be important is, imagine you find the world's oldest T-Rex. How can you prove that it's the world's oldest T-Rex if you don't know exactly where it was from and can't prove that it's from the oldest rocks? To be good at finding fossils, you need to keep your eyes peeled. Different types of fossils in different locations can look very different. In Dinosaur Provincial Park, some of the most important things to look out for are color, texture, and shape. Color, because the bones are a different color from the rock. The rock is often pretty gray and the bones are quite brown. Texture, because the bones are often smooth or have a very unique bone-like texture that's hard to describe, whereas the rock is sandy. And shape, because most of you probably would recognize different shapes of bones, like rib bones or even a skull. So it's easy to keep on the lookout for shapes you might recognize. Now let's look at the photo that I have here and quietly think to yourself whether you see any fossils in this photo. If you saw two fossils, then you would be right. The first one in the front is probably the limb, or so either a leg or an arm of a dinosaur. And you just see one end coming out of the rock here, and then it's still partially covered by rock when you go to the left. And in the background, it's a little bit blurry, but we can see a very distinctive shape. And I can tell, even though I'm not getting too close, that this is a vertebrae, so part of the backbone of a dinosaur. So the shape here is very important. Now let's try that exercise again. I'm going to show you a different photo and you can see if you can find the fossils. So in your head, quietly to yourself, count how many fossils you think you can see. This is pretty tricky to do from a photograph. Normally you'd be able to get on your hands and knees and look, but there are some, at least some obvious fossils in this photograph. I'll give you a minute and then I'll tell you how many I found. Now, even I probably didn't count all of the photos or the fossils in this photo. It is very hard to do from a photo, but just to give you an idea, looking at the most obvious fossils, I counted 14 fossils. So if you counted at least 14 fossils, then you were on the right track to finding all of the fossils in this photo. Now, if we look at one more picture, let's see if we can find where the fossils are in this photo. So think to yourself quietly where you think the fossils might be. If you were looking in this part of the photo, you would be right. As you can see, there are a series of different bones sticking out of the rock all along this surface. So this was either an entire skeleton or a bone bed preserved in this area. And you can tell that it's there because of the different color, the different texture, and the different shapes coming out of the rock. Now, once a paleontologist has found a fossil that they want to collect, they must record its location. If it's an individual or a solitary bone, a GPS coordinate is easy to do. But sometimes we find a whole bunch of fossils together. On the left, we have a picture of a dinosaur bone bed. That means that there are bones from multiple different individuals, all smashed up and mixed together. There are a whole bunch of bones in this photo. Some of them are hard to see because they're kind of dusty, but there's one here, one here, one here, one here, one here, and then basically the whole surface is covered in bones. So we call this a bone bed. And often in bone beds, the orientation of the bones and the relationship of the bones to each other can be important. So paleontologists will make detailed maps. This is often done by holding a grid level and drawing the map by hand as if you were looking at it from a bird's eye view. Now, once you have recorded all of the relevant details of the fossil, the next step is to actually remove the fossil from the ground without damaging it. Usually this means making a field jacket. And if you want to think of what a field jacket is, it's very similar to a cast that a doctor would put on your arm if you broke it. It's made out of plaster of Paris and burlap. And all it does is encase the rock, the bone and the rock surrounding it into a hard shell so that it all stays together and won't get broken up during transport. So sometimes a field jacket is pretty small and only has one bone in it, like on the left. This kind of field jacket is easy to make, easy to remove, and easy to carry out of the field. But sometimes field jackets can be a little more complicated. On the right, there's a photo, there's a giant field jacket, and this field jacket contains almost all of the elements of a dinosaur skull. It took 8 people about 4 weeks to collect this dinosaur skull, and it's too heavy to carry out of the field. So we had to hire a helicopter to airlift it out. Now, once the fossil does make it back to the lab, the next step is you have to remove all of the rock because this fossil is still encased in rock. This process is called preparation. Technicians will slowly and carefully remove all of the rock surrounding the fossil, but being very careful not to break it. That's because fossils, even though they are rocks themselves, are quite delicate. They often have a lot of cracks from freeze-thaw cycles. And sometimes there are even pieces that have broken off and need to be glued back on. Most of the time, this type of job can be done pretty quickly, and you only need to use hand tools. The types of tools are very similar to the types of tools you'd see in a dentist's office. We have toothbrushes, dental picks, knives, scalpels, tweezers, paintbrushes, and like I already mentioned, a very special type of glue. Like I said, sometimes it's easy and it can be done pretty quickly. So the range of time it takes to prepare a fossil can be something between hours and years. I think the fossil that I recall taking the longest time to prepare took 8 years. And like I said, sometimes glue is used to prevent a fossil from breaking more, and sometimes we need to put fossils back together. This on the left here is an example of sometimes what we have to deal with. Imagine a 3-dimensional puzzle with no reference picture that may or may not have all of the pieces and may even have some extra pieces thrown in. That's a pretty tricky puzzle, but the paleontologist here was able to glue all of these pieces back together into a dinosaur tooth. Different preparation projects are all a little bit different. Here are 2 very different examples. On the left, this field jacket had very, very, very hard rock in it. Rock that was too hard to remove with hand tools. So instead, I had to use an air scribe, which is kind of like a dental drill. It's a tool that vibrates and it helps crush the rock surrounding a bone while still not damaging the bone itself. When we have to use more high-tech equipment, we often have to use a lot more protective equipment. You can see I'm using a respirator, ear protection, and something to protect my hand from vibrations. On the right, this is a very different example. This field jacket was gigantic. It contained almost an entire hadrosaur in it. Because it was so gigantic, I couldn't reach the center of it unless I was sitting inside of it. But the rock was so soft and easy to remove. All I needed to prepare this entire specimen was a knife, a brush, and some glue. So if you're wondering what it actually looks like to prepare a fossil, I have a quick little video here. This is a turtle shell that I prepared. And so you can see the first step involves removing all of this matrix, this gray stuff from the bottom right corner. Most of the matrix was already removed before I even started. And some of the rock was hard, so I had to use the air scribe, which is the vibration tool that I talked about. And then to flip it over, we need to make a support for the side I just prepared. This is called a support jacket. And then I have to remove the other side of the field jacket. And now here I am preparing the other side. And while I have to use an air scribe for a lot of it, I also use another technique called air abrasion, which is kind of like sandblasting the fossil, but we use very particular particles that won't damage the fossil itself. That's what this white powder is. So that's me basically sandblasting the fossil. It gives it a nice polish at the end. So that's what a turtle shell looks like. As you can see, it was a giant turtle shell. For those of you interested, it's called basilemes. Now, once the fossil is all prepared, we do also have to store it. This is still part of the preparation and conservation step of a paleontologist. Now, when we have a fossil that is beautifully preserved, like on the left, in like a death pose, we want to keep all of those bones in place because they're much more useful to us in learning how the creature, what the creature looked like. So in this case, we would only prepare 1/2 of the fossil and leave it in the field jacket. But this takes up a lot of space, and so we only do this if the specimen is particularly nice. Otherwise, for storage purposes, and also just so that you can see all sides of a specimen, of a fossil, we'll remove the entire fossil from a jacket. And here is an example on the right of all of the different bones from a single field jacket. This was from a horned dinosaur bone bed. And you can see there's a part of a frill here on the right. There's a vertebrae here on the top left. There's a tiny baby jaw, baby lower jaw of a hadrosaur, or not a hadrosaur, a horned dinosaur. And then a whole bunch of other pieces, little broken up pieces that don't have homes right now. But we had to build special supports and beds for all of them so that they don't risk getting damaged over time. The nice thing is these will all fit nicely in a drawer, whereas the specimen on the left takes up a lot of space. Now, once the fossil is all clean, paleontologists finally get a chance to look at them and can actually study them and do research to learn what more about the creatures that were fossilized. Sometimes that involves learning more about what the creature looked like. This is an example of something that paleontologists learned through research, is finding a whole bunch of a specific type of dinosaur called ornithomimids. And they found lots of different skeletons that had the skeleton, yes, but also this weird kind of brownish matter around the bones. And after finding lots of different examples, and some better examples than this, they discovered that these are actually feathers, preserved feathers. So we learned that some dinosaurs, particularly ornithomimids, had feathers, and you can see the reconstruction on the right. This is important because now we know that most dinosaurs are more closely related to birds than lizards. Sometimes studying fossils can also tell us more about how a creature lived. So I've already talked about bone beds a couple of times. So I've shown you this picture on the left already. This is a dinosaur bone bed. Dinosaur Provincial Park has hundreds of bone beds, and they all seem to be of horned dinosaurs, with very few other creatures mixed in. And each bone bed has hundreds of individuals. It's not just hundreds of bones, it's a whole bunch of different horned dinosaurs. And so by looking at all of these bone beds, researchers were able to find out that horned dinosaurs actually lived in herds. And that's why we find all of these bones mixed in together. It's because they died all together because that's how they lived. Now, once all of the research is done, the final job of a paleontologist is to share what they have found with the world. Sometimes this is done with publishing papers, but not everybody gets to see those papers. More likely than not, the public is going to learn about dinosaurs in museums and through displays. But fossils are heavy because they're now rock, they're fragile, and they're precious, sometimes even one of a kind. If you look at the picture on the left, this is Black Beauty. It's a T-Rex that's displayed at the Royal Tyrrell Museum in Alberta. Look at this skull. Imagine how dangerous it is to have this skull dangling here with a risk of falling and hurting somebody, or breaking and shattering into pieces. It's not really the safest way to display a specimen. So sometimes, not always, but sometimes paleontologists will determine a specimen is too precious, or is too precious to be displayed, or the way they want to display it is too dangerous for the specimen. In those cases, paleontologists will make exact copies, which we confusingly call casts. So in this case, a cast is a copy. It's not the same thing as the cast you would put on your arm if it was broken. So we make exact copies of bones, and then we put those on display. Another example of why we might not want to put the original bones on display is, as you can see on the left here, we are welding the armature of a pachyrhinosaur, so this is another horned dinosaur, to be put on display. And in order to make this dinosaur stand up the way it does, we had to drill holes through every single one of the vertebrae. So all of the backbone could have a metal bar stuck through it. And even all of the ribs have metal bars in them to make sure that the ribs don't break. So this would be very damaging if we did this to the original bone. So we would either have to find a new way to have it stand upright, or in this case, we chose to use a cast. Now, a lot of people get disappointed when they hear that a fossil is just a cast. These casts are exact copies. They are so good that researchers can do research on them as if they are the original. And paleontologists take a great deal of care to try and make them look as close to the original for the visitors as possible. You can see on the right here, I am painting an Albertosaurus so that the bones look exactly like the bones that were originally discovered. Here are some examples of some original skull parts, so either the pantodont skull or the Albertosaurus dentary, and then above each of those is the cast. So a lot of care is put into making them look as close to the original as possible so that the viewers don't lose anything from seeing a cast instead of the original. I do want to emphasize, though, not everything you see in a museum is a cast. There are lots of original specimens on display also. Now, we have just gone through all of the major steps, all of the major tasks that a paleontologist does. But different types of fossils require different types of care. So I'm going to go through a couple of different other Canadian fossil sites that I worked on and show you how the different preservation of those fossils require different care, namely in how we find the fossils and how they are collected. First, we have Mistaken Point, which is a UNESCO World Heritage Site and ecological reserve in Newfoundland. You can see here, there are these flat surfaces jutting out into the ocean, right along the coastline. Each of these surfaces is a snapshot of the deep sea floor at the time. So these sea floors existed 565 million years ago. So they're quite old. If you were to walk on one of these surfaces, you'd actually be able to walk on an ancient sea floor. Now let's look at what the fossils actually look like. On the left here, we have an example of what the fossils look like. And on the right, we have an example of what paleontologists believe the creatures look like in real life. They're quite unusual. We call them Ediacaran fossils because they lived during the Ediacaran period. But like I said, they're very unusual creatures. They were soft-bodied. They didn't have any hard parts. And they're potentially related to they are potentially the earliest primitive animals that ever existed. Some of them, or most of them, were attached to the seafloor and extended up into the water column and were thought to absorb nutrients from the water. But look how different they look compared to dinosaur bones. So because they're so different, they need to be treated differently. Firstly, they are not three-dimensional objects. They're actually just impressions. Because they're soft-bodied, they're preserved as impressions, kind of like if you made a footprint on the ground. And because of that, searching for these fossils is very different from dinosaur fossils. The material that makes up the fossil is exactly the same as the surrounding rock. So there's no real color difference. There's very little texture difference other than the impression itself. And so the easiest way to find the fossils is by looking at shadows because they're impressions. These two pictures are the exact same photo taken in different lighting. On the left, we have lighting from when the sun was really high up in the sky. On the right, we have a photo when the sun was really low. So you can see here that paleontologists have a hard time prospecting for these fossils because they can't work if it's too cloudy or rainy. They have to work either early in the morning or late in the afternoon to get the best view of what these fossils looked like. Another important difference is because this is an ecological reserve, these fossils cannot be collected. They're a pretty limited resource, and as the coastline is eroding away, we're slowly losing this surface. So instead, paleontologists will make a mold in order to make casts, kind of like what we did with the dinosaurs for display, but in this case, this is purely for research. So you can see here, Research Casting International made a giant mold where they painted on either latex or silicone, waited for it to set, and then peeled it off. And then they could use that mold to create either individual casts or copies, or casts or copies of an entire surface. The nice thing about doing it this way is then you have these fossils that you can put in perfect lighting conditions so that you can see all of the details you can't see when you're in the field. If you're interested in seeing a cast or copy of the seafloor from a staking point, you should visit the Miller Museum. Now let's go to the Burgess Shale. The Burgess Shale is in BC, and it's in the Rocky Mountains. It preserves fossils that lived around 508 million years ago in the ocean. So even though this is in the mountains today, it was once the ocean. These creatures are a little younger than the Ediacaran creatures that I just showed you, but they again are very different. They're preserved differently and they look different. So you can see here, we have 3 different examples. The fossils are on the top and our idea of what they looked like are on the bottom. And these are preserved as carbonaceous films. So these soft-bodied creatures were squished in the mud, and a lot of pressure was created so that now there are just these films. They're 2-dimensional. They don't have a lot of relief, so you can't really use texture to find them. The easiest way to see them is through color. The funny thing about it is that while Ediacaran fossils, water makes it harder for them to see, it's actually easier to see Cambrian fossils when they're wet. For those of you interested in what the sea life looked like in this time, I guess I should go over, we have Anomalocaris here, which is a big shrimp-like predator. It's quite large. We have a hallucigenia here, which is a worm with big spines. And then we have Canidaspis here, which is an arthropod, so related to crabs that we see today. And so this is what the world would have looked like in the Cambrian. So definitely different from the Ediacaran, but also very different from the Cretaceous, where the dinosaurs lived. And because they're preserved very differently, once again, the conditions to collect them are very different. These fossils are allowed to be collected with a permit. And the best way to do this collection is by creating a quarry, which means digging into the rock and breaking out the fossils as you see them, so they don't have a chance to be weathered away. So on the left here, we have a picture of a quarry. And you can see that we actually, to make this quarry, we needed to use jackhammers and a combination of like mallets and chisels to break away this shale, because it's really, really, really hard rock. And this shale would break into these flat plains that create kind of these steps. And then each of these steps would have fossils on them. And if we found a fossil we wanted to collect, we would use a rock saw, a diamond-tipped rock saw, to cut the fossils out of the rock. The nice thing about this is that now you have a nice, neat little package of fossil that you can, that you're not worried about breaking too much because the rock is so hard. So all you need to do is wrap it very carefully in newspaper and pack it carefully in a bin to bring back to your museum, instead of having to make a field jacket. So now you know what it takes for a paleontologist to get a fossil from discovery to display. It's a very long process with lots of interesting steps. We talked about finding the fossil or prospecting. We talked about collecting the fossil from the ground. We talked about cleaning the fossil up so you can better see it. We talked about the research that gets done to learn about the fossil and why they're important. And we learned about how fossils get put on display for the public to see. And then we also talked a little bit about how the different types of fossils and the different types of preservation affect the way these fossils get treated in the museum, whether it's making support jackets and field jackets to protect the fossils and using a lot of glue, whether it's making a molds and casts because the original specimens are too precious to collect, or whether it's spending a lot of time painstakingly cutting fossils out of the rock, but not needing to do very much preparation later. So I hope you've all enjoyed learning about paleontology with me today. And with that, if you have any questions, I'd be happy to answer them.
Kala, thank you so very, very much for that informative and interesting presentation. I'm going to ask when we get the recording whether we can please include this in the kits that we're going to be making available to our local schools as an introduction to the whole area of paleontology. That was such a comprehensive presentation. I think it will help everybody. Okay, now we're going to open the floor to questions. We hope there are lots. Just enter them in the Q&A box or the chat. And Linda, I'll ask you to take over basically facilitating the question period. Thank you.
Great. So we have our first question from Alec. So what is the most studied dinosaur?
That is a good question. I know that in Alberta, probably the most popular dinosaur to study and the dinosaur that was first discovered is Albertosaurus. And because it's a theropod-like dinosaur, kind of like T-Rex, a lot of people find it very cool. So I suspect that people have studied it a lot. But because it was the first dinosaur found, it was also had a much longer time to be studied. So that would be my guess.
Sounds good. So another question is, where and what was the first fossil that you ever found?
The first fossil I ever found, well, the first research I ever did would have been during my undergrad thesis at Mistaken Point, but those fossils we already kind of knew about. So I wouldn't have found them. We already knew that those sites existed. So the first fossil I actually found was probably during my master's when I went up to the Northwest Territories looking for Ediacaran fossils, particularly trace fossils. And you have to climb up the mountains, hike up the mountains, and look through all the scree slopes. And some of the rocks in the scree slopes have fossils and some of them don't. And so I just spent all day picking up rock after rock and seeing if you can find something. And so that's where I found all of the fossils from my master's, lots of trace fossils, but that's also where I found the first of its kind fossil, the Annulitubus or Secretubulus annulatus, which I was able to name. So that was probably the coolest fossil that I found.
Great. So another question is, what is the most interesting thing discovered in Canada, I guess, fossil-wise?
There are lots of different interesting things that are found in Canada. One thing I didn't mention when I talked about the dinosaurs with feathers is I actually worked with the preparation technician who discovered feathers in the first place on the ornithomimids. And so she's a preparation technician. She didn't do the research herself, but she was responsible for removing the rock. And if you're not careful or not paying attention, she could have easily removed those feathers because they weren't obviously feathers at the time. She noticed something unique and pointed it out to the researchers, and it became clear that they were important, and we later found out they were feathers. So there's that. There are also lots of really beautiful dinosaurs that have come out of Dinosaur Provincial Park, like the, well, not Dinosaur Provincial Park, but Alberta, the Suncor nodosaur, which you may have seen. It's like a mummified ankylosaur, which is one of those tail club dinosaurs. And you can see the entire specimen, like including its skin and everything. So we have an idea of the colors that it was and all of that. But then we also have, like I said, we have Ediacaran fossils, which are some of the oldest animals we've ever seen. And Canada has some of the best examples of those. And then Burgess Shale type fossils are beautiful too. And Canada has some of the best of those. So it's really hard to pick.
Very true. So Linda has a question. Did dinosaurs live around the world or just in Canada?
The world was shaped or the land masses were shaped very differently back 65 million years ago than they are today. But we do find dinosaurs on, I think, almost all continents. I know that there are lots of dinosaurs we can find in South America and Mongolia, even in the Arctic, like the Canadian Arctic. We're finding fossils of dinosaurs because back in the Cretaceous, that was like a tropical environment near the equator.
All right, I have one that maybe is just I'm not sure if you know it, we might have to look it up, but when was the first T-Rex fossil found?
I don't actually know when the first T-Rex fossil was found, but that is a good question.
Okay, someone has asked, what is your favorite dino?
My favorite dinosaur is probably Centrosaurus apertus. It's a horned dinosaur, so I talked about those a lot. They have like the nice frill, and they have the big nose horn and the big horns over their eyes. I don't have a really good reason why I like it the most. I think that they're very interesting creatures, and I think that that whole group of creatures are interesting because they have these different ornamentations. You can tell the different types of horned dinosaurs based on whether their nose horn is longer or whether their eye horns are longer and how big their frill is. And we think that a lot of that is for identifying their own species. Centrosaurus apertus just has a lot of bone beds. So we have a lot of specimens of them. I think they're cool looking.
Okay, someone has asked, what is your favorite color and animal?
My favorite color and animal. My favorite color is green. And my favorite animal, that's a difficult question. I really like red pandas.
I also like red pandas. I have a question about the Burgess Shale. So do we know how many fossils have been found in the Burgess Shale? Are there more to be found? What happened to make the fossils? And why do some of the fossils look really weird or strange? Lots of questions.
That's a lot of questions. Where to start? Linda, do you want to give me these questions one at a time?
Sure, definitely. So do we know how many fossils have been found at the Burgess Shale?
I don't have an exact number. I imagine that the curator of the ROM would have a pretty accurate number of how many fossils are found because he's been the main collector from those fossils, but like hundreds and hundreds and hundreds.
Second question, are there more to be found?
There are many, many more to be found. Point of fact, when I did my volunteer work for the ROM, the Royal Ontario Museum, that was only in 2014, and they had just found a whole new site, and they were just finding new sites of that all along within the mountains. And I don't think that has ended. Like, we're constantly finding new fossils, and in the rocks, like if you're quarrying into the rock, you're constantly going to find rocks that have not been exposed to the surface since they were deposited. So there's lots of fossils to find.
Okay, and then what happened to make those fossils? Like, how did they originate?
I don't know the nitty gritties of how these fossils were created, but they lived in the water column or on the seafloor. And then they would have died. It may have been like an anoxic environment, so an environment that they like went into that didn't have enough oxygen for them to live, and they basically suffocated. And then they would be covered in mud and silt, so fine grained material to help them be preserved. And then they would have been squished once that rock, you know, the sediment was turned into rock. And that's why we get these carbonaceous films. And sometimes the preservation is so pristine that we even get some of the guts preserved and things like that.
And then the last part of that set was, why do some of these Burgess Shale fossils look very strange?
That is a very good question. Part of it is that they look very strange is because they were weird and wonderful experiments in evolution. And so, you know, some of these creatures evolved, you know, a really, really, really long time ago, 508 million years ago, 542 million years ago. And the conditions in which they lived are very different from today. And so the things that they were, the way in which they were evolving would have affected their different shapes. There's also a lot of interesting research about early evolution and Hox genes that I don't fully understand. Maybe Linda can answer that a little bit better. But they look different because evolution has come a long way. And so we have a lot of, there are a lot of things that are related to Cambrian fossils that live today, like shrimp and crabs, and they just look different because they've evolved a long way.
Yeah, I'll just add on, we think that it was sort of a time of experimentation. There wasn't very much going on, so there was a lot of ways you could expand. For example, there's that Opabinia fossil, which has like 5 eyes and like a claw, like an elephant's trunk with a little claw at the end. So that obviously didn't turn into anything in the end. So it was a lot of experimentation at the time. Okay, another question. How do you get the fossils out of the rock, and have you ever broken one?
Before I answer that question, I wanted to add on about the Burgess Shale fossils. We're finding lots of fossils. We're still finding new fossils too. So if you read in the news, like I think even this year, maybe last year, there have been new species found. So it's not just that we're finding lots of the same old, we're finding lots of new stuff too. So how I get the fossil out of the ground, very carefully. And we also will sometimes bring our special glue into the field so that we can prevent things from being broken. I personally have not broken a fossil in the field, but I know many people who have. One of the most famous fossil breaks was a failed helicopter lift, where technicians spent months trying to get this specimen all covered in a nice support jacket or field jacket. And they misjudged the weight, and the helicopter took off, realized it was too heavy, and had to drop it or risk crashing. And the paleontologists were very upset, but that's what glue is for, I guess. And we were able to put it all back together.
Okay, these are a few that are sort of related. So what made you choose this profession? How do you like working where you do? And do you like your job? So they're all kind of related.
I mean, yes, I very much like my job. I got into it partially just because I took some elective courses learning about the history of life. And I found that very interesting. When I originally went to university, I was going for classical studies, which is actually archaeology. So I ended up deciding that learning about ancient animal life and was more interesting to me than ancient human life, even though I still think that's interesting too. But it's a very, very cool field to work in. There are lots of different jobs for a paleontologist. When I talked in my presentation about all of the jobs of a paleontologist, they have different titles. So those who do research are usually the curators and professors most of the time. And then there are often people hired specifically to prepare fossils, which is something that I did, or to create displays, which is something that I did. So if you're interested in only one part of the process, there are often jobs for you to do that. I've just done all of them because I find them all interesting. But there's a lot of flexibility, and there's a lot of time you get to spend outside, which is nice. And there's a lot of artistic freedom too.
Yes, so many things that you can do related to fossils. Highly recommended. So one question is, do you like Jurassic Park?
I do like Jurassic Park. The dinosaurs are not terribly accurate, or at least many of them are not accurate anymore because science has come a long way. But I don't think that that's a problem. I actually went to a talk at the Royal Trail Museum from one of the animators of those movies, and he discussed how they created those animations. For example, with the horned dinosaurs, trying to figure out how they moved, and they would model that movement based on animals that we have today, like rhinoceroses and elephants. And he showed kind of how they would copy the movements of creatures that we see today that had similar body shapes and use that for the animations, which is very cool. So there's a lot of really interesting stuff that you can learn from those movies, even if it's not all 100% accurate.
Very true. So what kind of dinosaurs are in Canada?
We have lots of different dinosaurs in Canada. That's in some ways a complicated question because there are lots of different groups of dinosaurs. And I think we have just about all of them in Canada, but they don't all live together because dinosaurs existed for a very, very long time. And so they didn't all exist at the same time. But yeah, we have the horned dinosaurs, we have the duck-billed dinosaurs, we have the theropods, which are like the T-Rexes and the velociraptor type creatures. We have the tail club dinosaurs. We have the I can't remember what they're called, the hard-headed dinosaurs that would butt their heads together. We have basically everything, but we don't have every species or genus, but we have all of the different general shapes.
Great. So what was your biggest fossil that you ever found?
The biggest fossil that I ever found was probably what I showed you in that field jacket that took 8 technicians like a month to collect. I wasn't the one who found it per se, but I was a part of that process of collecting it, and it's quite large. It takes it quite large and heavy, and I believe it's still being prepared. So it's a pretty involved project.
Okay, another question. What is the most rare dinosaur you ever found?
Ooh. I mean, I found pieces of lots of dinosaurs, but I would say the dinosaur that is, or the type of dinosaur that is the hardest to find are the small dinosaurs that are kind of related to birds. And that's because they have very delicate hollow bones and they crush very easily. So I found pieces of them, but I've never found enough of one to actually identify which dinosaur it came from.
All right. What was the year the last dinosaur was alive in?
I can't say exactly, but the end of the Cretaceous was about 65 million years ago. And that's when we think that all dinosaurs went extinct. But obviously that's a little bit blurry because dinosaurs are birds evolved from dinosaurs, and birds did survive that extinction. So it's a little hazy as to what exactly went on there. But basically most dinosaurs went extinct 65 million years ago.
So this one asks, how heavy are dinosaur bones?
Fossilized dinosaur bones are basically like picking up a rock of that size. They can be quite heavy. If you have anything larger than like, I don't know, if you have anything larger than something that you could carry in like 2 hands, you often need more than one person to help you carry it.
Very true. So this is a question, I kind of know the answer, but have you ever found a fossil floating in a volcano? Just thought I'd put that up.
I have never found a fossil floating in a volcano. I have never been to an active volcano, so there's that. But also, if a fossil would be floating in a volcano, it would probably melt, and so we probably wouldn't see that fossil anymore.
Very true, right? Because lava is just melted rock, right? Okay, so what do you do with original fossils that you replicate into casts? What do you do with the originals?
The originals are usually kept in collections. So each museum has a whole back section to that museum where they have drawers and drawers and skids and skids of fossils. And they're kept carefully, and they often have an entire staff, collection staff, and who are responsible for making sure that that environment is climate controlled and checking up on those fossils to make sure they're in good condition and are not degrading. But essentially, if you ever are able to get a behind the scenes tour of a museum, you will get to see all of the fossils that don't make it onto display.
So how many fossils would you estimate that you have personally found?
I guess it depends on whether you count full fossil or fossil fragment, but I would say generally in a summer, I'd probably find something like probably around close to 50 dinosaur bones in a summer. And I worked on dinosaur bones for, I think, 3 or 4 years. And then Ediacaran fossils for my master's, I collected something like 10 pails of fossils. And if each fossil is about this big. So a lot, a couple hundred.
Yeah, it's easier when they're not so big as dinosaurs, right?
Yeah.
Yeah. So we have one here. So how do you dig so deep to find the fossils? And then related, how old are the fossils that you found? And yeah, that's pretty much it.
Well, we often have to use lots of different tools to dig deep. Generally, okay, so in Dinosaur Provincial Park, we do not dig looking for fossils. We look for fossils on the surface and then dig around them to help collect them. We don't bother digging willy-nilly because the likelihood of actually finding a useful fossil is low. So we don't need to dig too deep, but we use shovels and picks and various different types of hammers and things to dig down and around a fossil and then undercut it a little bit so that we can put the support jacket on. When we're quarrying, that's when we dig a little deeper, and that often involves using power tools like jackhammers and rock saws. And so the power tools do most of the heavy lifting there.
Yeah. How about, are there fossils in caves?
Presumably there would be fossils in caves. It's a kind of a loaded question. So the fossil walls might have, or the cave walls might have fossils in them because they're made out of carbonate rock, which often have a lot of ocean creatures in them. So you'd probably be able to see some fossils in the cave walls, but there might also be fossils that are created by a creature that dies in a cave. I personally haven't found any fossils in caves, but I would believe that they would exist.
Okay, that same person has asked both, what do you think the most famous dinosaur is? And then have you ever found the most famous dinosaur?
Like I said, in Alberta, the most famous dinosaur is Albertosaurus. But I think probably in the world, the most famous dinosaur is probably the T-Rex. And they're related, so they do look very similar. I have not found either of those other than teeth. I have found many Albertosaurus teeth, which are very cool, but otherwise I have not found Albertosaurus bone parts.
Okay, so is there a possibility that dinosaurs still exist on places on Earth that we haven't sort of explored or discovered yet?
I suppose anything is possible. I think it is unlikely. The extinction event that wiped out all of the dinosaurs is thought to have wiped out basically everything above a certain mass, like above a certain weight, which is pretty high. So only very small things survived. And even then, I still think it's likely we would have found dinosaurs if they were still around. Though I will say, birds have evolved from dinosaurs. So in some ways, dinosaurs have lived on in that evolutionary stream of birds.
Very nice. Someone has asked, are you famous? Have you ever studied a geode?
I don't think I am famous. I have published some papers, but other than that, I am basically a nobody. So
because you've named a fossil, your name will live on.
that is
Whenever
true.
someone now talks about that fossil, they have to mention Cala's name, so she will be.
That is true. I have never studied a geode. I mean, I have seen geodes and I think they're very cool, but they do not have fossils in them, and therefore I have not spent very much time studying them.
Okay, so someone has asked, do fossils have mold on them because they are so old?
No, fossils do not have mold on them because mold is a living creature that wouldn't survive the fossilization process and then beyond. However, you may have noticed in some of my Dinosaur Provincial Park photos of fossils, there's a lichen growing on those fossils. So that's modern day lichen. It's around today, and it's leaching out the minerals that basically preserve the fossil. So the fossil has minerals in it that turn it to rock, and then the lichen preferentially likes those minerals. So one of the other things you can look for in Dinosaur Provincial Park is areas with lots of lichen on them, these orange lichen, because it's often a fossil, but it's also eating the fossil, so that's not great.
Very cool. So have you ever made your own fossil?
I have made many copies, many casts of fossils, but I have not made my own from scratch because that would not be a true fossil. Yeah, I have made many casts of various fossils that are on display in various museums, which I'm very proud of.
Very cool. Only a few more. So someone was saying that they have ichthyosaurs, which is actually a type of extinct marine reptile in the UK. So do we have them in Canada?
We do. We have a couple of different marine reptiles, but because they're marine reptiles, we don't see them in the same areas that we see dinosaurs most of the time, because most of the dinosaurs are preserved in like riverbeds, and most of the marine reptiles are preserved in like that interior sea I was talking about. So Manitoba and Saskatchewan have tons and tons and tons of marine reptiles, whereas Alberta has more of the dinosaurs.
Yep, and there are also some pretty cool ichthyosaurs, including like the largest one ever found somewhere in the Rockies in BC somewhere. I don't know, like somewhere like that. So another one is, besides dinosaurs, do you get involved in sort of more modern animals like mammoths or after the Cretaceous?
I have not done very much work with more modern creatures or things kind of like the Ice Age stuff. There is a researcher at the Royal Tyrrell Museum who I did work with, who did work on mammals, and so they were a little bit younger, but you have to be near the right age rocks. I also, when I was in Nebraska, I did visit a very cool site down there. What was it called? Ashfall. And that's an area where there's a whole bunch of like Ice Age type animals that died in a Pompeii-like way. And so there are a whole bunch of just carcasses of animals that have all died in situ. They were near like a a watering pond. And so I have seen a lot of those fossils. I just haven't studied them.
Okay. Would you ever send multiple copies, I guess, of casts to different museums after you made them?
Yeah, that's actually one other reason why we make casts. So the reason I highlighted was for our own display purposes. But sometimes researchers can't visit the museum that you work at, and they're working on that type of dinosaur. And so they might ask for a copy, so a cast, to be sent to them so that they can work on it without having to travel. Also, other museums might want to display the same thing that you're displaying, or something that you have and you don't have on display. So there's an exchange. I mean, I believe they usually buy them, but there's an exchange of resources when it comes to casts and museums.
Great. And the last thing is more of a recommendation. So someone recommends the book called Dinosaur Hunters by Deborah Cadbury. It's about Mary Anning, who's a pretty famous paleontologist, a female paleontologist in the early 1800s in the UK.
Oh, wow. Yeah, I haven't read that, but
I haven't read that either, actually. I should.
And Linda, if I could just share my screen for a moment. I am going to, for all of the educators that are out there, we also have a virtual platform as part of Science Rendezvous, where there is something called STEM on Demand. And if you click on this button for the 2022 STEM book list, you will find a whole series of books about paleontology, about the people who were paleontologists. And for children who are interested, here is the book called The Daring Dinosaur Lady, The Daring Discoveries of Mary Anning, the First Paleontologist. And over here, where we have the story of a fossil, we can also have links to some other resources, including Cala's talk from today. So we can share a number of things for people to follow up with about the webinar. So thank you very much. Excellent questions. My goodness, Cala, you've had to think a lot today.
oh yeah, keeping me on my toes.
Okay, Linda, I'll leave it to you to wrap up.
Right. Well, so thank you so much, Cala, for presenting this really interesting talk. We learned so much. And thank you everyone for all the questions. Yeah, so I guess that concludes the seminar. And please visit the Miller Museum if you have time. If you have time and you're in Kingston, you can see Cala maybe, and perhaps see some of the fossils we have on display, including a really nice mistaken point cast.
And for those of you who are, sorry, my throat just went, near Trenton, Ontario, we also have the new Quinte Museum of Natural History. And right now there's a huge dinosaur exhibit there. And Linda, help me, I think it's the sauropods that are there right now. Anyway, so very, very interesting museum to visit. So, and then we'll have our kits where we'll be bringing dinosaurs into the schools.
Yep.
So
the Quinte Museum is run, yeah, it's run by RCI Research Cast International, which mounts the dinosaurs and does casts of some of the most famous dinosaur skeletons from all around the world. So,
and Cala actually showed us the work that they were doing at Mistaken Point. So, yep, interesting. We have so many different wonderful resources in and around the Kingston area, including Cala and Linda. Thanks very much, everyone. We'll see you again. Watch for the recording of this in a couple of days.